before the world cracked open under the weight of its second global war, before entire cities turned to ash and millions vanished in camps behind barbed wire, there was a man sitting behind a desk in a modest consulate in Lithuania. Not a soldier, not a spy, just a quiet diplomat with ink-stained fingers and a conscience that wouldn't sit still. His name was Chiune Sugihara. In 1940, the streets of Kaunas were tense. The Second World War had turned Europe into a chessboard of collapsing regimes and shifting borders. Lithuania, once independent, had been occupied by the Soviet Union. Rumors of further turmoil rippled through the city. Refugees flooded in, Jews from Poland, displaced families from Austria, Germany, Czechoslovakia, all carrying the same hollow-eyed urgency. They had seen what the Nazis were doing in the West. Now, with Hitler's shadow inching closer from one side and Stalin's red tide pressing in from the other, there was a growing panic among those who knew that time was no longer measured in years or even months, but in days, hours, minutes. Chiune Sugihara was Japan's vice-consul in Kaunas. By appearance, he was reserved, dutiful, the image of a proper diplomat. But something flickered behind his polite demeanor. He wasn't just taking in reports or hosting receptions. He was watching, listening, and when hundreds of desperate Jewish refugees began appearing outside the gates of the Japanese consulate, begging for transit visas to escape to safety, Sugihara did not look away. The refugees needed passage across the Soviet Union into Japan, a route that, on paper, didn't exist. Japan's foreign ministry had issued strict instructions. Transit visas were only to be given to those who met rigid conditions, documents, destinations, guarantees. But most of the people at Sugihara's door had none of these. What they had was fear, raw, undiluted terror. Parents clinging to children, men with trembling hands, elderly grandparents leaning on canes, whispering in Yiddish, their words soaked in dread. Sugihara was under no illusion. Granting these visas without Tokyo's permission would be an act of defiance, a career-ending, possibly life-endangering breach of orders. But what do orders mean when you're staring into the eyes of a family who may not survive the week? History doesn't often celebrate quiet men. It favors generals, conquerors, leaders with booming voices and clenched fists. But this man, this quiet Japanese diplomat in the middle of a small Baltic country, no longer even in control of its own fate. He was about to make a decision that would ripple across generations. At first, he wrote a few visas, then a few more, but word spread quickly. Each day more came, not dozens, hundreds. He awoke early, often before sunrise, and sat at his desk for hours, sometimes 16, 18 hours straight, writing each transit visa by hand. His wrist ached, his eyes burned, his back stiffened, but he kept going. Outside, lines stretched around the block. Families waited for days, sleeping on sidewalks, clinging to hope in the form of a man who, until recently, had been a stranger to them. He sent cables to Tokyo, asking for permission to issue the visas. He explained the dire humanitarian need, the moral responsibility, the sheer scale of what was happening. The answer came back. No, then again no, and again. Bureaucracy does not bleed. Policy does not tremble at the sound of mother crying. But Chiune Sugihara did. And so, faced with a choice between obedience and humanity, he chose humanity. This wasn't just paperwork. Each visa he signed was a lifeline, a name, a destination, a chance. And though he never said aloud, he must have known he wasn't just helping strangers escape. He was drawing a line in the sand against the tide of apathy and complicity that swept through much of the world during those years. In the annals of World War II, most nations closed their borders. Most diplomats followed rules. Most people told themselves there was nothing they could do. But this man, sitting in a sunlit room with a fountain pen and a stack of blank forms, refused to be one of them. This was just the beginning. His story, like the trains he helped people catch, was about to gain momentum. But already, before the Nazis had even reached Lithuania, before the full machinery of genocide had begun to churn, Sugihara had made a decision few others would make. The question that haunted those days, for so many Jews running from death, was simple. Who will help us? In Lithuania, the answer was unexpected. It wasn't an ally. It wasn't a soldier. It was a man from Japan with a kind face and a steady hand, who chose to save lives by writing his own defiance in ink. By the summer of 1940, Kaunas was no longer a safe place. The Soviet occupation had tightened its grip on the region, and German forces were pressing from the west. Every street corner buzzed with rumors that the Nazis were advancing, that the Soviets were rounding people up, that escape routes were vanishing overnight. But in a quiet corner of the city, behind the wrought iron gates of the Japanese consulate, Chiune Sugihara was still writing. Day after day, he sat at his desk, surrounded by stacks of passports, scraps of paper, hastily scribbled names and addresses. His hand cramped, his wrists swelled, but the urgency in the eyes of the people outside his gate erased every thought of stopping. His wife, Yukiko, brought him food he often forgot to eat. She massaged his fingers between writing sessions. They were both in this now, not just as diplomats, but as something more, a witness, a lifeline, a defiant voice whispering yes in a world full of no. And the risk was no longer theoretical. Soviet agents kept a close watch on foreign consulates, and Sugihara knew that disobeying Tokyo while under Soviet occupation was a dangerous game. His own staff grew nervous. He was no longer following protocol. He wasn't just bending the rules. He had snapped them in half and set fire to the pieces. But even then, he remained calm, focused, committed. He had grown up in a Japan steeped in duty, obedience, and hierarchy. As a young man, he had studied in Manchuria and served in the foreign service with discipline and loyalty. He was, by every measure, a product of the system. But there's a difference between blind loyalty and moral clarity. And somewhere in that narrow space between the two, Sugihara found his truth. He had been trained to represent his country. Now, he was representing something else. A higher loyalty, a deeper obligation, one that couldn't be explained in diplomatic cables or office memos. Outside the consulate, the line never shrank. Families clung to hope in the form of a single sheet of paper, hastily signed and stamped. The visas weren't glamorous. They were simple transit permits, allowing passage through the Soviet Union to Japan, with an onward destination to places like Curacao, a Dutch island in the Caribbean. But in a world falling apart, even the faintest chance of escape was a miracle, and the word had spread like wildfire. Some refugees didn't even have passports, just scraps of identification, family names, or photos. Sugihara didn't ask too many questions. He understood. The paperwork was never going to match the reality, but that didn't mean those lives didn't deserve saving. At one point, he was issuing hundreds of visas a day, each one handwritten. No typewriters, no assistants, just ink, stamps, and his unwavering will. He worked through meals, through exhaustion, through the fear that his superiors would intervene at any moment. And yet, every new sunrise brought him back to that desk, where his resistance came not through speeches or protests, but through the simple, steady act of writing. Tokyo, of course, was not pleased. His requests for official approval were met with firm rejections. The Japanese Foreign Ministry had no interest in becoming entangled in Europe's refugee crisis. Japan, allied with Nazi Germany, was tightening its grip on nationalism and militarism. There was little appetite for compassion. Orders were orders. But Sugihara had seen too much, heard too many stories. The faces outside his gate weren't just strangers. They were echoes of humanity he couldn't ignore. He had looked into their eyes, wide with terror, hollowed by grief, and realized that obedience meant nothing if it required complicity. Still, every action has its price. Sugihara's disobedience would not go unnoticed forever. In late August 1940, the Soviet authorities informed all foreign diplomats that they had to leave Kaunas immediately. Their consulates were to be closed. Lithuania would be absorbed fully into the Soviet Union, and no exceptions would be made. Sugihara had days, perhaps hours, to leave, but instead of packing, he doubled down. He moved from his desk to his hotel room, then to the train station, and even there, surrounded by guards and chaos, with the train engine rumbling and the whistle screaming departure, he continued writing. Surrounded by refugees clinging to the last thread of hope, he passed out visas by the handful, barely glancing up. His arm trembled with fatigue, his body running on adrenaline and something stronger, conviction. It said that as the train began to pull away, he leaned out the window, still signing, still stamping, and threw visas into the crowd. Paper after paper fluttered down like falling leaves, caught by desperate hands reaching upward. It is hard to imagine the courage it took to do that, to stand alone between a cruel war machine and a collapsing world, and simply choose to help. No gun, no uniform, just a pen. And yet, those slips of paper, thousands of them, would become the lifelines for generations. Chiune Sugihara didn't know most of their names. He never heard their stories. But because he chose to act, an estimated 6,000 Jews and countless descendants lived to tell theirs. He left Lithuania with no medals, no fanfare, just the weight of what he'd done, and the quiet dignity of a man who fulfilled his duty, not to an empire, but to his own soul. The train pulled away from the station in Kaunas, its wheels groaning like the burden it carried. Chiune Sugihara leaned back in his seat, exhausted. His hand, swollen and raw, still trembled. The stack of visa forms was gone. Every last one either handed out or scattered like falling prayers in the crowd of outstretched arms below. Around him, silence. But in the world, a storm continued to rage. What began as a small act of defiance in a distant Baltic consulate was now something far larger. The refugees who had received Sugihara's visas were not just moving pieces on a map. They were fathers, mothers, children, scholars, tailors, musicians, dreamers. And now, they were survivors on borrowed time. With those flimsy papers in hand, they began their journey east, first through the Soviet Union, often packed into trains that rolled for days, then weeks across the vast, cold expanse of Siberia. For many, it was the first real breath of hope in months. But it wasn't easy. They had no money, no official welcome, just a thin promise of safe passage and the will to move forward. Some reached Vladivostok, battered and frostbitten, clutching their visas like lifelines. There, they boarded ships bound for Japan, a nation foreign in language, culture, and climate. Most arrived in Suruga, a quiet port city on the Sea of Japan. And there, another miracle awaited. Instead of hostility or suspicion, many Japanese citizens offered food, shelter, even kindness. It wasn't universal, and it wasn't always enough. But it was something. From Japan, their paths split. Some moved to Shanghai, where a growing Jewish refugee community was forming. Others waited for further transit, to Canada, Australia, Palestine, the Americas. But one truth followed them all. Had it not been for the signature one man in Lithuania, their journey would have ended long before it began. Among them were remarkable individuals. Nathan Gutworth, a teenager at the time, would later become a noted rabbi in the Netherlands. Dr. Joseph Rosenstein went on to lead a major hospital in Israel. Entire family lines, doctors, teachers, artists, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, traced their lives today back to a single sheet of paper, signed by a man most never met, in a language they couldn't read, from a country they had never dreamed of visiting. One man, one pen, one choice. But while thousands were building new lives across the globe, the man who made that possible was returning to a very different fate. Chiune Sugihara arrived back in Japan with little ceremony. His superiors were aware of what he had done. The Japanese government, increasingly aligned with the Axis powers, didn't look kindly upon rogue acts of compassion. He was reassigned, then reassigned again. Eventually, his diplomatic career was over. Officially, it was a downsizing. Unofficially, it was a quiet dismissal, a way of saying you disobeyed and now you're done. With his career gone, Sugihara turned to whatever work he could find. He took jobs translating documents, teaching part-time, working for trade companies. His family struggled. There was no pension, no recognition, no apology. For decades, his heroic act was forgotten by the world, even by his own government. And yet, he never regretted it. He never sought fame, never gave interviews, never published a memoir. In his own quiet way, he moved on, not because it didn't matter, but because he believed what he had done was not extraordinary. He had simply done what needed to be done. It was his wife, Yukiko, who later revealed just how much he had endured. The sleepless nights, the shaking hands, the fear, the sense that he might be putting his family in danger, but also the calm resolve with which he made his decision. He had seen people facing death, and he could not turn away. And while he returned to obscurity, across oceans and continents, survivors and their children were telling his story. Quietly at first, then louder. Reunions were held, trees planted in his honor, letters written to governments and historians. And in time, the world began to remember. But Sugihara himself never boasted. When asked later why he did it, he simply replied, they were human beings and they needed help. That was it. No speeches, no grand decorations, just a recognition of humanity. In an era when so many claimed they had no choice, he chose. And that made all the difference. After the war, the world turned its gaze to reconstruction. Cities were rebuilt. Nations redrew their borders. The horrors of the Holocaust slowly came into focus, photograph by photograph, testimony by testimony. But amid the ashes and the reckoning, some names, like Oskar Schindler, emerged into public consciousness. Others, like Chiune Sugihara, remained ghosts in the margins. For decades, his story remained nearly invisible. He returned to Japan quietly, with no accolades or welcome, no parades or medals. His act of defiance, the writing of thousands of visas that saved Jewish lives, was not officially acknowledged, not even mentioned. His disobedience had cost him his career, and in the rigid post-war bureaucracy of Japan, such actions were not admired. They were a blemish, a reminder that someone once placed individual conscience above imperial policy. So he lived simply, in a small house in Fujisawa, working modest jobs. He and his wife raised their children, paid their bills, and carried away a past that few around them even knew existed. It might have stayed that way forever, if not for survivors. In the 1960s and 70s, the Jewish community scattered across the globe, in Israel, America, Europe, began tracing their survival back to one source. Patterns emerged in stories told at kitchen tables, in community centers, at memorials. And one name kept coming up, whispered with reverence, Sugihara. Some called him the Japanese Schindler, though the comparison was imperfect. Sugihara didn't run factories or bribe Nazi officers. He simply wrote, relentlessly, and gave people a way out, but the impact was the same. He had saved lives, not for politics, not for profit, but because he saw people in danger and refused to turn away. In 1968, one of those survivors finally tracked him down. The meeting was quiet, emotional, and powerful. For Sugihara, it must have been a strange experience to look into the eyes of someone who was alive because of something he had done decades earlier and long buried in silence. It wouldn't be the last. In 1984, nearly 44 years after the events in Kaunas, Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center in Israel, officially recognized Chiune Sugihara as one of the righteous among the nations. It was an honor given to non-Jews who had risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. It was a rare title, one never handed out lightly. Sugihara was invited to Israel. For the first time in his life, the full weight of what he had done was placed before him. Streets were lined. Children held signs. Grandchildren of the people he had saved sang songs in Japanese. Trees were planted in his honor. At a formal ceremony, survivors embraced him, weeping. Many simply said, "Thank you for my life." And for a man who had lived in obscurity for so long, it was overwhelming. He didn't speak much. He didn't have to. The room already knew. But still, Japan remained largely silent. It wasn't until after his death in 1986 that broader recognition began to grow. Japanese officials slowly acknowledged his actions, but it was the survivors and their descendants who truly kept his legacy alive. One by one, they wrote books, produced documentaries, organized educational programs. They told their children, "You are here because of the Japanese man you never met, in a country far away, who saved your grandmother, your father, your aunt." These were not just footnotes in a textbook. These were living, breathing legacies. Today, it's estimated that more than 100,000 people are alive because of Chiune Sugihara. Some were born in Israel, others in Europe, America, Australia. Doctors, engineers, poets, rabbis, athletes, all carrying a thread that leads back to one man with a pen and a conscience. And in time, the world began to understand that what Sugihara had done was not simply diplomatic rebellion. It was moral leadership of the highest order. Statues were raised. Streets were renamed. Films were made. But perhaps the most telling tribute came not in bronze or awards, but in a small, simple phrase that began appearing in Jewish homes around the world. We are Sugihara's people, a community formed, bonded not by language or geography, but by gratitude. Gratitude for a man who chose action over comfort, ethics over obedience, courage over silence. And that's what history often forgets, that behind every mass movement, every war, every sweeping art of global change, there are moments of personal decision, unseen, quiet, risky. Sugihara's story is not about victory in battle or strategy in war rooms. It's about the simple power of standing up alone when it matters most. He never sought recognition, never asked for praise. And yet, the echo of what he did continues to grow louder with each passing generation. Because when the world turned cold and bureaucratic and cruel, one man warmed with the heat of his humanity, and in doing so, lit a fire that still burns. Legacy is a strange thing. For some, it comes wrapped in medals and parades. For others, it arrives long after they're gone, in whispers, in books, in the lives of those they never met. For Chiune Sugihara, the legacy he left was vast, but the price he paid for was heavy, and for years, mostly invisible. After he was dismissed from Japan's foreign service in the late 1940s, the man who once held diplomatic rank across Europe now struggled to feed his family. He worked odd jobs, language teaching, freelance translation, clerical office roles for shipping companies. There was no hero's welcome, no recognition from his homeland. He became just another quiet, aging man in post-war Japan, his past sealed in silence, his heroism kept hidden even from some of his own children. That silence wasn't just bureaucratic. It was cultural. In post-war Japan, obedience and conformity were deeply ingrained values. To defy orders, even for moral reasons, was seen not as noble but as shameful. Sugihara had broken ranks. He had disobeyed direct government instruction, and although his defiance had saved thousands, it had also embarrassed those in power. So his story wasn't taught in schools. His name wasn't mentioned in history books. It was as if the world had decided his heroism was inconvenient. But inside the homes of the people he saved, his name was sacred. Entire generations of families traced their existence to one moment in time. The moment a Japanese diplomat chose to sign a visa instead of turning someone away. At weddings, at bar mitzvahs, at family dinners, his name would come up like a prayer. Sugihara, the man who gave us life. And slowly, that private reverence began to breach the public sphere. In Israel, children of survivors began pushing for more awareness. Jewish communities began organizing events. Letters were sent to Japanese officials. And then came the scholars, Holocaust historians who unearthed testimony after testimony pointing back to Sugihara. His story, like so many acts of quiet courage, had been hiding in plain sight. In the 1980s, Japanese journalists finally caught wind of it. One, inspired by the scattered accounts he found in Jewish archives, traveled to interview Sugihara at his home in Fujisawa. By then, the former diplomat was old, his voice soft, his body frail. But when asked why he did what he did, his answer had not changed. I did not do anything special. I only did what I thought was right. That humility wasn't false modesty. It was the code he had lived by, and perhaps that's what made his actions so powerful. Sugihara didn't think of himself as a savior. He didn't wear a cape. He didn't expect a thank you. He simply refused to look away. When he passed away in 1986, his funeral was small. Few government officials attended, but messages poured in from around the world, from Israel, Poland, America, Canada. Survivors sent flowers, letters, photographs of children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, And slowly, Japan began to catch up. Monuments began to appear. A memorial in Yatsu, his hometown. A plaque at the train station in Kaunas. A tree planted in his name at Yad Vashem. His old consulate in Lithuania was transformed into a museum. School children now tour its halls, reading the names of the people he helped save, understanding the magnitude of what one man can do when faced with moral choice. And more than that, he became a quiet symbol in Japan for a different kind of courage, not the samurai sword or the battlefield honor, but the courage to break rank, to say no, to follow one's conscience even when the world demands silence. Today, Chiune Sugihara's name is taught in some Japanese schools. His story has appeared in textbooks, documentaries, films, and even anime. But perhaps the most striking tributes aren't found on screens or in lectures. They are found in the quiet moments, when a survivor lights a candle in his memory, when a grandchild of a refugee visits Japan just to leave flowers at his grave, when someone stands in front of a wall of names at Yad Vashem and whispers, "This man saved my family." And yet, there's something deeper, something unresolved that clings to Sugihara's legacy, the reminder that moral clarity is often lonely, that doing what's right rarely feels like triumph in the moment. More often, it feels like risk, like fear, like sacrifice. Chiune Sugihara didn't win a war. He didn't command armies or change the fate of nations, but he changed the world for thousands. And the world, in turn, eventually realized that sometimes the truest heroes are not those who fight with weapons, but those who fight with principle. When faced with an impossible choice, duty to his government or duty to humanity, he chose the latter, and the ripples of that choice continue to spread. Because in the end, the story of Sugihara is not just about what he did. It's about what we all could do, if we had the courage to listen to our conscience, even when it whispers in defiance of everything we've been taught to obey. Every generation faces its own test, not always with war, not always with genocide. Sometimes it's quieter, a test of conscience, of character, of whether one will stand or step aside. The story of Chiune Sugihara lingers not just because it happened, but because it reminds us of what could happen again, and how easily humanity slips when rules become more important than lives. In most ethical debates, disobedience is seen as a breakdown, a failure of the system. We are taught to obey, follow the chain of command, stick to the rules. But Sugihara's story flips that narrative. His defiance wasn't a failure. It was a salvation. And the system? It was a failure that needed to be defied. At the time, Japan was a country gripped by imperial loyalty. The nation had allied itself with Nazi Germany, and within its bureaucratic layers was a rigid culture of obedience. Orders from above were absolute. The chain of command was sacred. Honor, in many ways, came from submission. Sugihara, educated and trained within that very system, should have done what he was told, but he didn't. And that raises an uncomfortable question. What does it mean to be moral inside in a moral system? This question isn't just historical. It's alive today, around the world, from authoritarian states to democratic institutions. Individuals are told to follow orders, adhere to policy, protect protocol. And often, these instructions are wrapped in flags, logos, constitutions, signs of legitimacy. But legitimacy isn't the same as righteousness. And legality isn't the same as justice. Sugihara understood that. He didn't act out of rebellion or ego. He wasn't trying to undermine Japan. He wasn't looking to become a martyr. He simply saw the faces outside his gate and understood, if I don't act, they will die. And in that moment, he didn't consult strategy. He didn't hold a meeting. He just picked up his pen. What makes this choice so profound is how ordinary it seemed. There was no battlefield, no spotlight, just a man in a chair, writing as fast as he could. And yet, in those strokes of ink was a defiance more powerful than any military order. He wasn't just writing visas. He was writing resistance. This is where the story becomes something more than history. It becomes a mirror. What would you do if your job, your safety, your future, even your family were on the line, and doing the right thing meant losing everything? It's easy to say, I would help. Easy to say, I'd be brave. But most weren't. Most diplomats in Europe turned people away. Most governments closed their borders. Most people, facing the same scenario, did nothing. Sugihara acted. That's not to say it was easy. The decision to help came with cost. A ruined career, decades of financial struggle, isolation from his own government. There was no reward, no guarantee, just the weight of his own conscience, whispering that silence was unacceptable. In today's world, where information spreads fast and the news cycle moves even faster, it's easy to assume we would always know what the right thing is. But in the moment, truth is rarely clear. It's murky, complicated, surrounded by noise and pressure. Sugihara made his choice in that murk, not because it was safe, not because it was popular, but because it was right. And this is what separates him from so many others. Not just that he saw suffering, but that he didn't look away. He didn't rationalize it. He didn't pass the responsibility. He took it on, fully, knowing it could cost him everything. That kind of courage doesn't shout. It doesn't wave flags. It doesn't post hashtags. It simply acts when it matters most. And maybe that's the hardest part about Sugihara's story. It forces us to ask, what do we stand for? And more importantly, what are we willing to risk for it? The people he saved weren't from his country. They didn't speak his language. They couldn't repay him. But he didn't need repayment. He only needed to know that he had done what he could, in a time when apathy was a norm, when fierce silence, many, and self-preservation ruled the day. One man chose to be inconvenient, to break the rules, to disobey, and in doing so, he gave the world something rare, a reminder that even inside broken systems, there are still people capable of building bridges. Even when surrounded by darkness, one person with a clear conscience can still be the spark that lights the way. When we speak of resistance during the Holocaust, our minds often turn to uprisings, to Warsaw, to sabotage, to partisans in the forests. We think of those who took up arms, who defied with bullets and fire. But there was another kind of resistance, one often overlooked, yet just as powerful. It lived in silence, in paper, in moments of quiet refusal. And Chiune Sugihara's name stands among those who waged that war of the soul. He was not alone in defying the bureaucratic machinery of death. Others, scattered across Europe, chose to act. Raoul Wallenberg in Hungary, who handed out Swedish protective passes even as Nazi troops marched through Budapest. Aristides de Sousa Mendes of Portugal, who, like Sugihara, issued visas against his government's orders. Jan Zwartendijk, the Dutch acting consul in Kaunas, who worked alongside Sugihara to give Jews destination visas to Curaçao, making Sugihara's transit visas possible in the first place. They all risked careers and, in some cases, their lives to slow down the killing machine. But what set Sugihara apart is not just what he did, but how alone he was when he did it. In Kaunas, he had no network, no local resistance cell, no organizational backing. Just his wife Yukiko and his conscience. He wrote with no guarantee of success. No assurance that the Soviets would honor the visas. No confirmation that Japan would allow the refugees to enter. But he understood that any chance was better than none, and that no decision was neutral. Inaction would have made him complicit. That principle, that silence can be as dangerous as action, is something that resonates far beyond World War II. Sugihara's story has become more than historical. It's a case study in moral courage. In international relations programs, it's taught to young diplomats as an example of humanitarian action above state policy. In Holocaust studies, it's examined as a vital instance of civil disobedience in a diplomatic context. In ethics classes, it forces a conversation few are ready to have. When you break the law for the sake of saving lives? And increasingly, his name appears in unexpected places. When refugee crises erupt, in Syria, in Afghanistan, and Ukraine, activists and policy makers invoke Sugihara. His legacy becomes a measuring stick for conscience. What would Chiune do? Not rhetorically. Practically. Would he issue the visa? Open the gate? Step out of line? His story lives in these moments because the questions it raises are timeless. How do we treat the stranger? How far are we willing to go to defend the dignity of another human being? How much are we willing to risk for what we know is right? Even in Japan, a country where obedience and group harmony are deeply cultural values, Sugihara has become a subtle symbol of ethical resistance. He challenges the idea that loyalty to the state must always come first. His story is now used to encourage a new generation to think critically, to value human life above hierarchy. In Lithuania, where his story unfolded, his legacy is deeply honored. Schools teach his name. Museums preserve the history. Survivors' families return each year to visit the old consulate building, a modest two-story structure that once held back the tide of death with nothing more than handwritten ink and human will. But perhaps the most striking continuation of Sugihara's legacy comes not from institutions or governments, but from the people themselves. In Israel, a child once born in a Shanghai ghetto, made possible by Sugihara's visa, becomes a professor. In the United States, a grandchild of a survivor becomes a doctor. In Canada, a family celebrates a bar mitzvah, the boy carrying the name Chiune in quiet tribute. These are not statistics. They are living proof. A human chain of survival stretching from a desk in 1940s Lithuania to the present day. Every act of moral courage creates ripples. Most of them we never see. But Sugihara's ripples became waves, not just because of how many lives he saved, but because of the way he saved them, alone, with no sword, no crowd, no promise of glory, just paper, ink, and the conviction that a human life was worth saving, even if it meant breaking the rules. His story now walks beside us, not as a relic of the past, but as a question hanging over our present. When a moment comes, when injustice stands at your door, when lives hang in the balance and the right choice comes at a cost, what will you do? Sugihara already answered that question, and in doing so, he rewrote what it means to be brave. When Chiune Sugihara died in 1986, there were no grand state funerals, no military salute, no procession of diplomats laying wreaths. For most of Japan, he was still just a footnote, a forgotten name in a sea of post-war normalcy. But across the globe, candles were lit, prayers were whispered, letters were passed from generation to generation, retelling the story of the man who saved their family. Because while the world had moved on, those who bore his legacy had not forgotten. They couldn't forget. He wasn't just a name to them. He was the reason they existed. And in a way, that's what makes Sugihara's story so enduring. It's not preserved in monuments or dusty archives. It's alive. It lives in family trees, in the laughter of grandchildren, in the whispered bedtime stories passed down to remind the young that once, in the face of enormous cruelty, one man chose to be kind. Sugihara's strength was never in power. It wasn't in rank or influence or even persuasion. It was in his refusal to let fear decide for him. It was in his ability to see strangers as his own, to value life over loyalty, people over policy. He once said simply, "I may have disobeyed my government, but if I didn't, I would be disobeying God." He wasn't speaking religiously, necessarily, but morally. He understood that some truths are deeper than nations. That compassion is a language older than borders. And yet, even as the story is told today, it's important not to romanticize it. What Sugihara did wasn't easy. It wasn't celebrated. It came with consequences. He lost his position, his career, his standing. He suffered quietly for decades. That is the price that courage often demands, a price paid in silence, long before the applause ever comes. But that silence is exactly where his greatness grew, because he never stopped being who he was, a man with a sense of duty, not to orders, but to people, a man who looked at the machinery of death, at the indifference of governments, at the overwhelming weight of helplessness, and said, "Not here, not me, not now." And what makes a story so powerful today, in our world of noise and speed and distraction, is that it brings us back to something simple. That goodness is a choice. We live in a time when it's easy to feel overwhelmed. Global crises, refugee movements, war, division. The problems seem too big. And the temptation is to believe that unless we can fix everything, we can't do anything. But Sugihara's life says otherwise. He didn't fix the world. He didn't stop the Holocaust. He didn't topple a regime. He simply saw the face of a child in danger, the eyes of a mother begging, the shaking hands of father holding out hope, and he answered them, one by one, name by name, visa by visa. And because of that, thousands lived, thousands who now shape the world, thousands who carry his name in their hearts. We often ask, where were the good people during history's darkest moments? In Chiune Sugihara, we find our answer. He was there, quiet, steady, unmoving, not shouting, not grandstanding, just doing what was right again and again until he could do no more. And maybe that's the real lesson. That greatness isn't always loud. That courage isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just a man at a desk refusing to look away. So now, when the story ends and the credits roll, remember this. The world didn't need another soldier. It didn't need another speech. It needed one man with a pen to say yes when everyone else said no. That man was Chiune Sugihara. And because of him, we remember not just what was lost during the Holocaust, but what was saved. We remember that even in the bleakest times, humanity can still survive, as long as someone chooses to stay human.